The Mind Control Experiment. Part 1. When I landed the job at Octagon Research Facility, I thought I had hit the jackpot. It was a cutting-edge research center known for its innovative approaches and generous salaries. The recruitment process was intense, involving multiple interviews and rigorous background checks. When I finally received the job offer, it felt like all my hard work had paid off. On my first day, the facility seemed like a technological marvel. Security was tight, with ID scans and fingerprint recognition at every turn. I met Dr. Klein, the head scientist, who welcomed me warmly. He introduced me to the rest of the team, a mix of brilliant minds working on various groundbreaking projects. I was assigned to the Behavioral Studies Department under the supervision of Dr. Morgan. My initial tasks were mundane data entry, organizing files, and observing experiments from a distance. The experiments focused on enhancing cognitive abilities and understanding human behavior. Dr. Morgan seemed genuinely passionate about her work, explaining that they aimed to unlock the full potential of the human mind. One evening, as I was about to leave, I heard a faint rhythmic humming coming from a room at the end of the corridor. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. The room was locked, but the humming grew louder the closer I got. Suddenly, Dr. Morgan appeared behind me, startling me. "That area is off limits," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "We have sensitive experiments running there. You should head home." I apologized and left, but the incident piqued my curiosity. Over the next few weeks, I noticed odd behavior among some employees. They seemed overly compliant, their eyes vacant and their movements mechanical. It was as if they were sleepwalking through their tasks. One night, after everyone had left, I decided to stay behind and explore. Using a keycard I had discreetly borrowed from a colleague, I accessed the restricted area. The humming was louder now, almost hypnotic. I followed the sound to a lab where a group of employees sat in front of large screens, their eyes glued to the swirling patterns displayed. Dr. Klein and Dr. Morgan were there, observing the subjects closely. I hid in the shadows, watching in horror as the screens flashed rapidly, the patterns becoming more complex and disorienting. The employees' faces were blank, devoid of any emotion. "They're responding well to the new frequencies," Dr. Klein said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "Soon, we'll have complete control." I stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of papers. The noise alerted Dr. Morgan, who rushed over to investigate. I managed to slip out just in time, my heart pounding in my chest. The reality of what I had witnessed began to sink in. Octagon wasn't just researching cognitive enhancement, they were developing mind control techniques. The following days were a blur of fear and paranoia. I avoided Dr. Morgan and Dr. Klein, but I could feel their eyes on me, as if they knew I had seen something I shouldn't have. I wanted to quit, to run away and never look back, but I needed proof. One night I accessed the lab's mainframe and downloaded as much data as I could onto a flash drive. As I was leaving, the lights flickered and a chilling voice echoed through the speakers. "Thought you could hide from us?" I sprinted towards the exit, but the doors locked shut. Panic set in as I frantically tried to find another way out. Suddenly a hand grabbed my shoulder, and I turned to see Dr. Morgan standing there, her expression cold and unyielding. "You should have stayed away," she whispered, as darkness engulfed me. This was just the beginning. The true horror of Octagon's experiments was yet to unfold, and I was trapped in the middle of it, fighting for my sanity and my life. Part 2. When I woke up, I was in a sterile white room strapped to a metal chair. My head throbbed and my vision was blurry. As I tried to shake off the dizziness, Dr. Klein and Dr. Morgan entered, their faces expressionless. "We know you accessed the restricted area," Dr. Klein said, his voice cold and detached. "You've seen too much." I struggled against the restraints, but they were too tight. Panic surged through me as Dr. Morgan approached, holding a syringe filled with a clear liquid. "We can't let you leave," she said softly, almost regretfully, "but we can make you forget." She injected the liquid into my arm, and a wave of nausea washed over me. My thoughts became fuzzy, and I fought to stay conscious. Just as the darkness threatened to take over, the door burst open, and a group of men in tactical gear stormed in. "Put down the syringe!" one of them shouted, aiming his weapon at Dr. Morgan. Dr. Klein raised his hands in surrender, and Dr. Morgan reluctantly stepped back. The men quickly unstrapped me from the chair and escorted me out of the room. My vision blurred in and out of focus, and I could barely comprehend what was happening. As we moved through the facility, I caught glimpses of other rooms' employees hooked up to machines, their faces blank and unresponsive, others standing in rows, Their eyes glazed over as they repeated phrases in unison. "Stay with us," one of the men urged, shaking me gently. "You're going to be okay." We exited the building and climbed into a waiting van. The men secured the doors and sped off. As the adrenaline began to wear off, my head lolled back, and I finally succumbed to the darkness. When I awoke, I was in a small, dimly lit room that smelled faintly of antiseptic. My body ached, and my mind was still foggy, but I could tell I was no longer in the facility. The door opened, and a woman in a lab coat entered, holding a clipboard. "You're safe now," she said gently, checking my vitals. "You're at a secure location. Can you tell me your name?" "James," I stammered, trying to sit up. "James Carter. Nice to meet you, James." "I'm Dr. Sullivan," she said with a reassuring smile. "You've been through a lot. We're here to help you." "Where am I?" I asked, my voice weak. "You're in a safe house," she explained. "We intercepted the Octagon facility after receiving an anonymous tip. You're lucky to be alive." Memories of the past few weeks flooded back, and I shuddered. They were experimenting on people. Mind control. They tried to use it on me. Dr. Sullivan nodded. "We know. We've been tracking their activities for months, but we needed someone on the inside. Your information was crucial." "How did you find me?" I asked. "One of our agents infiltrated the facility and alerted us when you were in danger," she said. "We're still piecing everything together, but your testimony will be invaluable." As I rested, I overheard snippets of conversations between the agents. They were dismantling the facility, freeing the employees who had been subjected to the experiments, but the true extent of the mind control techniques was still unknown. Days turned into weeks as I recovered at the safe house. Dr. Sullivan and her team worked tirelessly, trying to reverse the effects of the mind control on the other victims. Some showed signs of improvement, while others remained trapped in a state of compliance. One evening, as I was sitting in the common area, a young woman approached me. Her eyes were hollow and her movements stiff. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They told me to find you." My heart raced. "Who told you?" She glanced around nervously. "The voices. They said you could help." I grabbed her hands, trying to steady her. "You're safe now. The people here can help you." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, you don't understand. The voices are still in my head. They never stopped." A chill ran down my spine as I realized the horrifying truth. The mind control experiments had left permanent scars. The victims were still connected, their minds entwined in a web of control, and I was their only hope of breaking free. As the reality of the situation sank in, I knew that my ordeal was far from over. The fight against Octagon had just begun, and I was about to dive back into the darkness to save those who were still trapped within its grasp. Part 3. Determined to help the victims still ensnared by Octagon's mind control, I dove headfirst into the research. Dr. Sullivan and her team provided me with access to the data we had extracted from the facility. It was a labyrinth of code, frequencies, and psychological triggers designed to manipulate and control. One night, as I pored over the files in the dimly lit safe house, I stumbled upon something chilling: a list of names, including mine. Each name had a series of codes next to it, likely representing the specific frequencies and patterns used for their conditioning. My blood ran cold when I saw the names of my co-workers who had exhibited strange behavior. "They were tracking us all along," I muttered to myself, horrified. The next day, I brought my findings to Dr. Sullivan. She reviewed the list, her face growing more somber with each name. "This confirms our worst fears," she said. "They weren't just experimenting at random. They had a method, a plan to create a network of controlled individuals. We need to find a way to reverse it," I insisted. "There has to be a way to break their hold." Dr. Sullivan nodded. "We're working on it, but it will take time. In the meantime, you need to stay vigilant. They might still try to reach you." A week later, I was in my room analyzing the codes when I heard a knock on the door. It was the young woman who had approached me earlier, her eyes still haunted but more focused than before. "Can I come in?" she asked softly. "Of course," I replied, clearing some space on the small table. She sat down, wringing her hands nervously. "I remember more now," she said. "Bits and pieces of what they did to us. They used something, a device. It looked like a helmet with wires and screens." I leaned forward, intrigued. "Do you remember anything else about it? How it worked?" She closed her eyes, concentrating. "They would put it on our heads and show us images, patterns, the humming sound. It was always there in the background. It felt like it was burrowing into my brain." Her description matched what I had seen in the restricted area. "Thank you," I said. placing a reassuring hand on her arm. "Every detail helps." As she left, a plan began to form in my mind. If I could recreate the device, maybe I could find a way to reverse its effects. It was risky, but it was our best shot. Dr. Sullivan was hesitant at first, but eventually she agreed to let me proceed. Using the data and the young woman's descriptions, we began to build a prototype. It was a crude version of the original device, but it was a start. The first test subject was a volunteer, a man who had been deeply affected by the mind control. We set up the device and carefully calibrated the frequencies, hoping to counteract the ones used by Octagon. "Ready?" Dr. Sullivan asked, her finger hovering over the switch. The man nodded, a look of determination on his face. "Do it." As the device powered up, the room filled with a low hum. The screens flickered to life, displaying patterns designed to disrupt the mind control signals. The man winced, gripping the arms of the chair, but he didn't cry out. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. Finally, the hum ceased, and the screens went dark. The man slumped in the chair, breathing heavily. "How do you feel?" I asked, my heart pounding. He looked up, his eyes clear and focused for the first time. I think it's gone," he said, his voice shaky. "The voices, they're gone." Relief washed over us. It had worked. But this was just one man. There were still many others who needed help. Over the next few weeks, we refined the device and treated more victims. Each success brought a sense of hope, but also a realization of the immense task ahead. The network of controlled individuals was vast, and Octagon's influence ran deep. One night, as I was preparing for bed, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Meet me at the old warehouse on 7th. Midnight. Come alone." I hesitated, feeling a surge of fear. It could be a trap, but it could also be someone with information. I decided to take the risk. At midnight, I arrived at the warehouse, my heart pounding in my chest. The place was dark and abandoned, a perfect setting for an ambush. I stepped inside, scanning the shadows. "James," a voice called out. I turned to see a man stepping forward, his face obscured by a hood. "Who are you?" I demanded. He pulled back the hood, revealing a familiar face. It was one of my co-workers, someone I had thought was beyond saving. "Marcus?" I asked, incredulous. He nodded, his eyes haunted. "I managed to break free, but only partially. They're still in my head, but I can fight it. I need your help." "How did you find me?" I asked, stepping closer. "They have a way of tracking us," he said, his voice urgent. "They know you're trying to break the control. They're coming for you, James. You need to be careful." Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. We both turned, realizing we were not alone. The true depth of Octagon's reach was becoming clear, and the battle to free the victims was far from over. The fight had just begun, and now I was in deeper than ever, with enemies closing in from all sides. Part 4. As the footsteps grew closer, Marcus and I ducked behind a stack of old crates. The darkness of the warehouse provided some cover, but I knew we couldn't stay hidden for long. "We need to get out of here," Marcus whispered, his eyes darting toward the exit. "How many are there?" I asked, trying to gauge our chances. "At least 4, he replied. "They're armed." I nodded, feeling a mix of fear and determination. "Follow me." We crept along the perimeter of the warehouse, keeping low and moving silently. The footsteps grew louder, and the voices of our pursuers echoed through the empty space. We reached a side door, but just as I was about to open it, a beam of light swept across the room, illuminating us. "There they are!" a voice shouted. "Run!" I yelled, shoving the door open and sprinting outside. Marcus was right behind me as we bolted through the alleyways, the sound of gunfire ringing in our ears. We zigzagged through the narrow streets, trying to lose our pursuers. My heart pounded in my chest and my lungs burned from the exertion, but we couldn't stop. After what felt like an eternity, we ducked into an abandoned building and hid behind a crumbling wall. The sounds of pursuit faded, and we allowed ourselves a moment to catch our breath. "That was too close," Marcus gasped, clutching his side. "Who were they?" I asked, still on edge. "Octagon's enforcers," he replied. "They use them to keep the controlled in line and eliminate any threats." I shook my head, anger boiling inside me. "We have to stop them. We have to free everyone." Marcus nodded. "But we can't do it alone. We need help." The next morning, I returned to the safe house and explained everything to Dr. Sullivan and the team. They agreed that we needed more resources and allies to take down Octagon. We started reaching out to other organizations, activists, and anyone who had a stake in exposing and dismantling the sinister operations of Octagon. Weeks passed as we built our network. People who had been affected by mind control, former employees who had seen the horrors firsthand, and activists who wanted to fight against corporate abuse joined our cause. The Safe House became a hub of activity, filled with meetings, strategy sessions, and constant vigilance. One evening, as I was working on refining the mind control reversal device, Dr. Sullivan approached me with a grim look on her face. "James, we have a problem," she said, handing me a folder. I opened it and found surveillance photos of myself and Marcus at the warehouse. "They've been watching us," I said, feeling a chill run down my spine. "It's worse than that," she continued. "They know about the Safe House. We have to evacuate." My mind raced as I considered our options. We need to move everyone to a new location, somewhere they won't find us. Dr. Sullivan nodded. "We have a backup site. He'll start making arrangements." As we prepared to leave, I found Marcus sitting alone, staring at a map of the city. "You okay?" I asked, sitting next to him. He sighed, looking weary. "I never wanted any of this. I just wanted to do my job, live my life. Now everything's turned upside down." "We're going to stop them," I said, trying to sound confident. "We'll free everyone, and we'll take Octagon down." Marcus managed a weak smile. "I hope you're right." That night, we moved everyone to the new Safe House, a secluded cabin deep in the woods. It was a temporary solution, but it bought us some time. As we settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time. The following days were a blur of planning and preparation. We continued to treat the victims, gather intelligence, and coordinate with our growing network. Every day brought new challenges, but also new hope as more people joined our cause. One evening, as I was working on the device, I received a call from an unknown number. I hesitated before answering. "Hello? James, it's Marcus," the voice on the other end said urgently. "I found something. Meet me at the old factory on the outskirts of town. It's important." "Marcus, we can't keep meeting like this," I said, my anxiety spiking. "It's too dangerous." "I know, but this is crucial. Trust me," he insisted before hanging up. I sighed, knowing I couldn't ignore his plea. I grabbed my coat and informed Dr. Sullivan of my plans. "Be careful," she warned. "We can't afford to lose you." The old factory was a decaying relic from another era, its windows shattered and walls covered in graffiti. I found Marcus inside, pacing nervously. "What did you find?" I asked, stepping into the dim light. He handed me a USB drive. "This has everything. Plans, schedules, locations. It's their entire operation?" My eyes widened as I took the drive. "How did you get this?" "An inside source," he replied. "Someone who wants to take them down as much as we do." As we discussed our next steps, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the factory. We turned to see a group of armed men entering, their guns trained on us. "Drop the drive," one of them ordered. I glanced at Marcus, who nodded subtly. I slipped the drive into my pocket and raised my hands. "You're coming with us," the leader said, motioning for us to move. As we were led out of the factory, I knew this was just the beginning of a new nightmare. Octagon was more dangerous than we had ever imagined, and now they had us in their grip. But I also knew that as long as we had that drive, we had a chance to expose their horrors and finally bring them down. The fight was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. We were about to face our greatest challenge yet, and the fate of countless lives depended on our ability to stay strong and outsmart our relentless adversaries. Part 5. They forced us into a black SUV, the windows tinted so dark it was impossible to see out. Marcus and I sat silently in the back, our hands bound, exchanging worried glances. The ride was long and tense, with the only sound being the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. After what felt like hours, we arrived at a secluded compound surrounded by high fences and patrolled by armed guards. They escorted us into a stark, windowless building and threw us into separate cells. The cold metal door clanged shut, leaving me in darkness. Time lost all meaning as I sat in the cell, my mind racing. I had to find a way to escape and get the USB drive to Dr. Sullivan. That drive was our only hope of taking down Octagon. After what felt like an eternity, the door to my cell creaked open, and 2 guards dragged me into an interrogation room. Dr. Morgan was there, her expression cold and calculating. "James," she said, sitting across from me, "you've caused us quite a bit of trouble." "Let us go," I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. She ignored my outburst. "You have something we want. Hand over the drive and maybe we'll consider being lenient." "I don't have it," I lied, hoping she couldn't see through me. Dr. Morgan's eyes narrowed. "You know, we could make this very painful for you." Before I could respond, the door opened and Dr. Klein walked in. He looked at me with a mix of curiosity and disdain. "James, you should have stayed away," he said, almost regretfully. "Now we have to make an example of you." He nodded to the guards, who hauled me out of the room and into a laboratory filled with ominous equipment. My heart pounded as they strapped me to a chair, securing my arms and legs. "We're going to recondition you," Dr. Klein said, adjusting a machine that looked eerily familiar. "Erase your memories, make you compliant." I struggled against the restraints, but it was no use. They placed a helmet on my head, similar to the one used in the mind control experiments. The humming sound started, growing louder and more intense. Images and patterns flashed on the screens in front of me, disorienting and nauseating. I clenched my teeth, fighting to hold on to my memories, my identity. The pain was excruciating, a searing agony that felt like it was tearing my mind apart. But through the haze of pain, I focused on one thought: I had to get out. I had to stop them. Back at the safe house, Dr. Sullivan and her team were growing increasingly worried. They had lost contact with me and Marcus, and they feared the worst. Desperation drove them to action, and they began planning a rescue mission. They gathered everyone who could help, including former employees and activists. Armed with the information we had gathered, they prepared to infiltrate the compound and free us. The reconditioning continued, each session more brutal than the last. I felt myself slipping, my willpower weakening. But then, in a moment of clarity, I remembered the drive. It was still in my pocket, a lifeline in this nightmare. During one session, as the guards were distracted, I managed to slip the drive out and hide it under the edge of the chair. It wasn't much, but it was something. If I could just hold on a little longer, there might be a chance. One night, as I lay in my cell, I heard a commotion outside. Shouts, gunfire, the sounds of a battle. My heart leaped with hope. The rescue team had arrived. The door to my cell burst open, and Dr. Sullivan rushed in, her face a mix of relief and determination. "James, we're getting you out of here," she said, helping me to my feet. I pointed to the lab. "The drive. It's in there. We need to get it." We fought our way through the compound, dodging guards and gunfire. When we reached the lab, I quickly retrieved the drive and slipped it into Dr. Sullivan's hand. "Go," I urged her. "I'll hold them off." "No," she insisted. "We're leaving together." With the help of the rescue team, we fought our way out of the compound and into the waiting vehicles. As we sped away, I glanced back at the burning compound, a sense of grim satisfaction washing over me. We had dealt a major blow to Octagon, but I knew the fight wasn't over. Back at the new safe house, we reviewed the information on the drive. It was more than we had hoped for detailed plans of their operations, names of key personnel, and evidence of their crimes. It was enough to expose Octagon and bring them down. But as we celebrated our victory, a chilling realization set in. Octagon wouldn't go down without a fight. They would come for us, and they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. We were in the eye of the storm, and the final battle was looming on the horizon. The fate of countless lives depended on our ability to stay strong, outsmart our enemies, and bring the truth to light. The nightmare was far from over, and the real terror was just beginning. Part 6. The tension at the new safe house was palpable. We knew Octagon would retaliate. Dr. Sullivan and I worked tirelessly to piece together the information from the drive, forming a comprehensive plan to expose Octagon's crimes. We coordinated with journalists, government officials, and activists, preparing for the final showdown. One evening, as I was reviewing the latest intel, Marcus approached me. He looked haggard, his eyes filled with a mix of determination and fear. "We need to act fast," he said. "Octagon's gearing up for something big. They're not just coming for us, they're planning to expand their operations." "How do you know?" I asked, my heart sinking. "An inside source," he replied, handing me a file. "They've been keeping tabs on us, but we have a mole inside their ranks. They've given us everything we need to strike first." The file contained detailed schematics of a new facility Octagon was building, a massive complex designed to house and control thousands of subjects. It was a horrifying realization Octagon wasn't just continuing their experiments, they were scaling up. "We have to destroy it," I said, feeling a surge of anger. "We can't let them do this to more people." Dr. Sullivan joined us, her face grim. "We have a plan," she said, "but it will be dangerous. We need to infiltrate the facility, gather evidence, and sabotage their operations." The night of the operation, we gathered our team and reviewed the plan. We would split into two groups, one to gather evidence and the other to plant explosives in key areas of the facility. It was a high-risk mission, but it was our only chance to stop Octagon. As we approached the facility under the cover of darkness, my heart pounded. We knew the risks, but we were driven by a sense of duty to stop the atrocities and free those still trapped under Octagon's control. We breached the perimeter, moving swiftly and silently through the shadows. The facility was heavily guarded, but our inside source had provided us with crucial information about their patrol routes and security protocols. Marcus and I led the team tasked with planning the explosives. We navigated the labyrinthine corridors, avoiding guards and security cameras. As we reached the main control room, we planted the first set of charges. The plan was to create a series of explosions that would disable the facilities, power, and infrastructure, crippling their operations. Dr. Sullivan's team was focused on gathering evidence. They accessed the central database, downloading files and recording footage of the horrific experiments taking place. The images and videos they captured were beyond anything we had imagined. Rows of people strapped to machines, their minds shattered and controlled. As we set the final charges, an alarm blared through the facility. Our cover was blown. Guards swarmed the corridors, and gunfire erupted. We fought our way back, the sound of explosions and shouts filling the air. "James, we need to go," Marcus shouted, pulling me towards the exit. We sprinted through the chaos, narrowly avoiding bullets and debris. The facility shook with the force of the explosions, and flames licked at the walls. As we reached the outside, we saw Dr. Sullivan and her team rushing towards us, clutching the precious evidence. "Get to the vehicles," Dr. Sullivan ordered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. We piled into the waiting vans and sped away from the burning facility. As we drove, I looked back, watching the inferno consume the building. It was a moment of grim satisfaction. We had struck a major blow against Octagon. Back at the safe house, we reviewed the evidence we had gathered. It was damning proof of Octagon's mind control experiments, their plans for expansion, and the names of those involved. We prepared a comprehensive report ready to expose the truth to the world. We contacted journalists, government officials, and human rights organizations, providing them with the evidence. The response was overwhelming. The media erupted with reports of Octagon's atrocities, and public outcry demanded immediate action. Governments launched investigations, and law enforcement agencies began rounding up those involved. Dr. Klein and Dr. Morgan were arrested, their faces plastered across every news outlet. The remaining members of Octagon's leadership went into hiding, but they couldn't escape the reach of justice. As the dust settled, we began the long process of helping the victims recover. Many were still struggling with the effects of the mind control, but with the facility destroyed and Octagon dismantled, they had a chance to heal. Months later, as I stood in the safe house, now a sanctuary for those affected, I felt a sense of closure. We had fought a long and brutal battle, but we had prevailed. Octagon's reign of terror was over, and the world was a safer place because of it. Dr. Sullivan approached me, a smile on her face. "We did it, James," she said. "We stopped them." I nodded, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. Yeah, we did. As we walked through the safe house, watching the survivors rebuild their lives, I knew that our fight had been worth it. We had faced unimaginable horrors, but we had emerged victorious. And in that moment I realized that even in the darkest of times, hope and determination could triumph over evil. The nightmare was over, but the memory of what we had endured would stay with us forever. And though the scars would remain, we had proven that courage and resilience could overcome even the most insidious of evils.